Once again, the U.S. is targeting China. As of June the 1st, entry bans have been slapped on an estimated 3,000 Chinese students and researchers who the White House accuses of engaging in intellectual property theft. Meanwhile, the U.S. is also making it difficult for China to arrange charter flights to fly its stranded citizens home. How will the new restrictions affect Chinese students already studying in the U.S. and probably planning to study in the future? Will U.S. universities become less attractive to Chinese students? Will the ban affect ongoing research? How stands to lose the most, and how should China respond? To talk about these issues and more, I'm pleased to be joined in Beijing by Flora Liu, founder of Joyview Education, from Chengdu by Wang Huiyao, president of the Center for China and Globalization, and by Skype from Washington, D.C. by Brad Farnsworth, Vice President of the American Council on Education. Later in the discussions, we'll be joined by Mark Wise, President of the Wise Consulting Group and former American Airlines captain. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Let me start with you, Mr. Wang. How would you say the impact to both sides caused by the U.S. decision to ban visas for certain Chinese students and scholars in the numbers of more than 3,000?
Well, thank you, Zhou. I think this is a really unwise move, actually, by the U.S. side and also by the President of the United States. First of all, the U.S. student and the Chinese student studying in the U.S. has actually contributed enormously in several ways. First of all, I think that a lot of Chinese students studying the science technology actually remain in the U.S. I saw the numbers that 80% of Chinese science technology PhD students stayed in the U.S. So it's a big talent pool for U.S. So this will actually hurt U.S. Innovation and the future development, R&D and things like that. Second, there's about 500,000 Chinese students in the United States. They generated 20 billion to 30 billion U.S. dollar revenues to the universities and the societies like that in the U.S. So this is no good as well. And thirdly, and I think that this actually had a big psychological impact both on the Chinese side and on the U.S. side on the student. So you're going to hurt bilateral student exchanges. As a matter of fact, I don't think that they can easily expel 3,000 Chinese students because because they are from certain universities, they didn't prove there any. You got to need evidence to say they have violated any laws or being conducted espionage. You got to have found evidence for that. You can't categorically say because they're from certain university in China, they are liable of breach the intellectual property and things like that. And also, University of Americans has a contract, contractual relation with them. They pay the tuition. They have been studied there. A university will like them to stay or whatever. So it's really up to university. I don't think government should intervene that much.
But their visa's going to expire. They're forced to come back to China. Isn't that the case, Mr. Wang?
Well, their visa is going to expire, but I think the universities will be, this is going to upset the American, probably academic community because all the universities rely heavily on Chinese student tuitions. Some will renew. Probably, I think there will be some numbers because of the visa, they won't get renewed. But for some students, if they had a visa, 5 years visa, they probably will continue on that. So I don't hope this policy will be implemented so harshly, and I think that there will be some room. I don't think that they really need to stop 3,000 students. I mean, you really need hard evidence to build a case to get one student out of the country. So I think this is really no good to the U.S. image as a talent magnet for the world.
And Flora, your institution has been helping students from China to study in the U.S. And have you heard any stories from them? How are students and their parents doing after hearing the news from the U.S.?
Thank you, Zoe. So my institution, Joy V Education, helps Chinese high school students or Chinese college students to apply to the U.S. colleges and U.S. Undergraduate schools. And this year, Chinese parents are especially concerned about the situation in the U.S., not because of the COVID-19. It's actually not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is actually the discrimination against the Chinese students. The parents are afraid that when their kids are in the States, they will be treated unfairly. So actually this year, we have seen a huge decline of the applicants to the U.S. universities and high schools or undergraduate schools. And some parents have postponed their decision. For those high school applicants, they've decided to postpone their application to the U.S. college. And for those college applicants, they decided to pause until it's time to apply for graduate schools. So it's actually, parents are very concerned about what the U.S. is doing right now.
And I want to know what other schools in the U.S. are thinking about the government's decision. Brad, have you heard any university staff and school authorities saying anything about the decision?
Yes, and it's great to be with you, Julia. It's really a pleasure, and hello all of you from Washington, D.C. Yes, we have heard from our universities here in the United States. There's a lot of concern about this change in policy. I will just emphasize a couple of things. One is that there's a lot we do not know about this policy. This estimate of 3,000 Chinese students affected is just an estimate, and I believe that comes from an article last week from the New York Times. We're still trying to determine the total impact of this policy and how it will be implemented. I have read the executive order now probably 3 or 4 times.
Are you saying it could be more than 3,000?
I honestly don't want to make an estimate. I think that the calculation is not something that is available to all of us. Probably the much bigger issue for our campuses and what they're very concerned about are additional restrictions on international student visas. These would not be specific to China, but they would have a huge impact on Chinese students. And I'll give you one example. There's still active discussion here in the United States about restricting the option to continue in the United States with an employer. And what we call this in the student visa, and Flora's students will be very familiar with this term, is optional practical training. This is the chance to remain in the United States after graduation and gain practical work experience. There's a serious debate now in the United States about suspending OPT. The argument being that OPT could potentially take away jobs from Americans. And of course, there's a lot of concern about unemployment here in the United States as a result of COVID-19. In terms of numbers, this would, I think, and Flora is the expert because she talks to Chinese students every day, but I think this would have a much bigger impact on the attractiveness of the United States. If you look at all the other destinations for Chinese students around the world, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, Canada, they all have options for continuing to work after graduation. And surveys consistently show that this is a really important consideration when Chinese students decide where to go overseas for study.
So Flora, what are the other options for those 3,000 or even more students who are now studying in the U.S. and probably want to have a temporary training program?
What I want to say is it's not a matter of those 3,000 students. It's about all the Chinese students who want to study in the U.S. Because remember last week, an unarmed African American was killed by a U.S. policeman, and that has actually frustrated millions of African American citizens in the U.S. So the 3,000 Chinese students visa ban is actually not only about 3,000 students. It's about all the Chinese families who are interested in the U.S. They have chosen other destinations, according to some of the conversations I had with my clients. They have chosen Australia, they've chosen the UK or Canadian schools rather than the US schools right now. So I'm just worried if the US continues its move, there will be less and less Chinese families who are willing to consider the US colleges. And for those 3,000 students who are banned from entering in the US, I think they can find other great institutions across the world, if not locally in China. As we all know, China has some great institutions like Peking University, Tsinghua universities. I'm sure those universities will be more than glad to accept exceptional scholars and students.
Will that really happen? This is a question, Brad, because we have been hearing, not only this time, the targeted students and researchers who are according to Washington, attached to the institutes that supports China's military-civilian fusion strategy. But obviously, a lot of Chinese students find it difficult to apply for visas studying in the U.S., and they've been undergoing lengthy inspections and customs. So is this becoming a trend? Is U.S. making it hard for Chinese students to go there to study?
Well, I think that there are several factors in play here. First of all, I want to emphasize that we have, in terms of American public opinion, it's still very strongly in favor of international students coming to the United States. Our recent survey shows that a solid majority of Americans welcome international students. And another solid majority even believes that they should be allowed to stay in the United States after graduation if they choose to do so and continue on to have permanent residence in the United States. So I think also within our government there's a lot of support for international students. There is an agency within our State Department called Education USA, and Flora will be very familiar with this agency. It is charged with promoting U.S. higher education around the world, and it tries to send out a very positive and welcoming message to international students. I agree that the recent events in the United States are very problematic and very tragic. And we all regret those very much, and I'm sure that that's led to some concerns on the part of Chinese students and parents. The one thing I want to emphasize that Flora stated very well is this is really a global market for students. This is something we emphasize all the time with our own government and with our member universities in the United States. Chinese students have choices. They have attractive choices in other parts of the world, and so it is competition, and that is good for Chinese students. To have those options is very good for Chinese students and their families.
And Mr. Wang, what do you think Chinese government should do? Is there an appropriate response? Because looking at the track record, be it trade, be it a Hong Kong issue, it seems China never wants to back down if America strikes.
Well, I think there's quite a few possible ways, and first is that I think China could, as one of our panelists just said, could bring back some of the students to study in China. I mean, that's always universities in China that are also relevant on those majors or specialty. And the second, of course, the diversification is not a bad strategy. I think China could, have more students into the other countries to study and to, deepen the relation academically and also exchanges with other countries. And thirdly, I think, we probably will help those Sino-American joint venture universities in China, like NYU Shanghai or Duke Queensland University. Or we may have even more welcome more American universities to set up their branches in China or campus in China. And finally, I think that this is not not morally is no good, but I think that China actually is a talent lost country to the United States. So this may actually help China to revert talent brain drain actually. So there's many advantages to China if U.S. has stopped this. But I think this is really no good. But we really hope that this academic exchange will continue, which benefit largely U.S. and China altogether.
That's interesting perspectives. We've also collected some opinions from social media users on this topic. Let's take a look what some of them have been saying about the exchanges between the two sides. This gentleman said, when the pain in China is short-term, the pain in the United States will be the price of this decline. Mr. Wang, about the pain and the gain part, who is to gain and who is to suffer the pain, and is it long-term and short-term?
Well, I think probably short-term China may have some disadvantages, but in the long run, I think that U.S. will definitely suffer because, as I said, they will suffer on academic changes. They will actually end up losing the talent, and also if there's a talent flight from the U.S., we will have more Chinese trained, high qualified talent return to China. So we probably will be gaining to China, and also that they will force China to develop a high level of R&D and academic development with other countries, and also be more independent. So I think that this actually China already has quite a good capacity in terms of artificial intelligence, big data, computer science, and all the rest. So this actually will enhance Chinese development in those areas. So make them wake up, rely less on the U.S. So it may not be a bad thing if they're really forced to do that. Yeah. So I think that Chinese is really will be gaining in the long run, definitely.
Brad, what are your thoughts on this policy might affect a lot of people, not only students from China, but also universities in America, joint research programs, and the pooling of resources. What is the long-term effects of this?
Well, thanks for the question. I want to emphasize I really don't feel like I know enough about this recent executive order to really assess the impact. But I will say, generally speaking, the loss of Chinese students coming to the United States, any decline, is bad for the United States, and I'll give you several reasons. One is simply economic. The economic benefits to our institutions are very substantial. Number two is I think actually much more important, and that's the interactions that Chinese students have with Americans. When we survey the American public on the issue of international students, a very solid majority say that the interactions, the daily interactions between American college students and international students from all over the world, not just China, but from all over the world, is one of the major benefits of a college education. Keep in mind that only 10% of Americans have the privilege of studying abroad. And the other 90% of American college students, they gain a lot of their international experience on their own campus through taking international courses and through interacting with international students. So this would be a loss of international students would be a loss for Americans as well as the institutions. The other thing I will say is that on the research area, research collaboration, if you look at any of the key areas, and I'm including not just the kind of research that takes place on American campuses, but the commercial research that takes place in American companies and firms, the amount of global collaboration is growing every year. If you look at some of these key industries like artificial intelligence, for example, the number of foreign nationals working in American companies is very substantial and contributes to U.S. competitiveness. And when we look at campuses and the kinds of really important research that's going on, it is overwhelmingly a global enterprise. We're doing a study right now at ACE on the field of virology, which of course is extremely important if we're going to find
especially now
a vaccine for COVID-19. We've looked at who is publishing in the top journals. We looked at who is getting the major grants from the U.S. government in the field of virology. It is a truly global enterprise with collaboration around the world between scholars in China, the U.S., Europe, and other parts of the world. So if we're looking at addressing the world's really biggest challenges, it's through global collaboration.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Brad, and also Flora. Now let's move on to the international flights between U.S. and China. So, Mr. Wang, a lot of people are asking why we don't send more chartered flights to bring back Chinese students home. Mr. Wang?
Well, probably there's several reasons. You know, first, with this pandemic and many countries stopped, reduced the flight or stopped the flights, and China and the U.S. being the two largest country in the world, actually also, U.S. actually announced, President Trump announced, stop the Chinese, flights and the tourism at the very beginning. I mean, even very early on. So there is a communication, I think, between those government and aviation agencies to sort it through, and between the airlines. Second, I think those COVID-19 really has slowed down the resumption. So the outbreak of the COVID-19 is still spreading in many countries. There is a concerns probably on government side as well. And thirdly, I think that I think there are some communication issues also related to this issue, that we really need to have a plan, have a effective communication, and have a really bilateral facilitation, accommodation to really resume some of those flights, to really getting the flights up and bring back the people, the country fellows that they want to come back. So I think there's many issues related to that.
But there is talk about communication. There is talk that the U.S. is setting a high bar for charters to pressure China into resuming business flights linking the two nations. But the context is America was among the first nations to shut down international flights from China when COVID-19 broke out. So what is China's rationale here?
Well, I think China now still, they maintained probably a minimum flight, and they also started a charter flight. And recently, they have announced they're going to resume some flights to some other countries, which I think is a good thing. But we really hope that we can resume more flights to the United States as well, because we have, after all, we do have many students in the United States and also people in the United States. So I think that all the countries should give really clearance and facilitation for that, rather than not resume as we really see there's a need for that. So I think that I think now as China has already contained COVID-19, and also we have effective measures to quarantine, and so probably now it's a safe time to bring more Chinese who want to return back to China, and also it's the holiday vacation time is coming. All the schools are closed, so it's time to bring some of them back if they want to come back.
We have Mark Weiss on the line. Mark, generally, how much damage has COVID-19 done to U.S. airline industries, and is international air flights ever coming back?
Well, thank you for having me. The COVID-19 virus has basically devastated the airline industry in the United States, and in many cases around the globe. There will be massive layoffs come the end of September. You're going to see that the amount of bookings are still going to be extremely low. It's estimated that it takes about 75% load factor on an airplane to be just break even. So anything above that 75% is going to start making money. Right now, I mean, a month or two ago, the average load factor in the United States was about 15%. Now it's getting up to about 40%, so hopefully it's climbing back. But hundreds of airplanes have been parked, and airlines are getting rid of older aircraft because they're less fuel efficient, and there's going to be fewer needs for those seats to be available.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that international travel is going to be coming back. It's going to be more limited. I think certainly it's going to start out with domestic travel first in the United States, and then we've already seen an expansion internationally of U.S. flights to Europe, and hopefully we can get back into well, we're already in the Asian market to some degree, but China is going to be a very big market for us again.
Some Asian hubs, air hubs, for example, Singapore and Hong Kong, already have loosened their restrictions on international travel. Do you think it is reasonable, and should all Asian airports resume operations as usual?
You know, I'm not an epidemiologist. I can't really say that. I think you have to look at it really from the scientific point of view first. What's safe? What gives people peace of mind to be able to travel? It's been very interesting that you know, a number of companies now do telecommuting and are finding it an effective way of doing business. So I think international travel is going to take a slower, longer period of time to come back than any domestic travel. But think of this. China, it had been estimated that only like 1 in 5 people in China had a passport. And a year or two ago, President Xi had said that he wanted to raise that proportion to at least 12 to 15%, which means millions of more Chinese with disposable incomes would be coming into the aviation marketplace. There's an enormous amount of expansion that will go on, both within China and externally and internationally. China and the United States and the globe need each other for economic reasons as well.
And Mr. Wang, we have seen no new infections here in China for many days. Why hasn't China opened its air travel to the outside world as some people wished?
Well, I think probably China was taking too much precaution, and but I do think that probably it's high time to do some of that, to open some of those flights, or the time has come. And if Hong Kong, Singapore, all the neighboring countries are doing that, China may lose some of those competitive market. And afterwards, I think China's economy will be the first one to recover after this pandemic. And then you remember last year, China has 150 million people traveled, outbound tourists. So I think when this situation calms down, China will be more actively pursuing you know, international travel, probably better than other countries. But also China have a large population outside China, like there is already 1.5 million Chinese students overseas. They all want to come back for the summer holidays. And if Chinese have no COVID-19, they definitely want to come back. So at least I see the short term, there's a strong need for the flights to come to China.
But that will put a strain on the
inspectors
and investigators on whether we can keep our quarantine as airtight as we wish.
I think, you know, China probably is one of the most effective countries to do that. You know, we have a very good quarantine. We have a lot of empty hotels. We have different cities. We have different decentralized strategies to do that. So I think, you know, we have very good big data monitoring system. China can cope with that. I know that there, you know, there's some special channel, green channel, like Germany has 3,000 German executive fly back. But there's other American executives.
Okay.
Many multinational, Chen is all complaining they are.
We are running out of time.
Come back. So I think it's time that we do something.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wang, and thank you, Mr. Weiss, for your analysis. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks so much for watching. Goodbye.